Good morning, everyone. Welcome again to Saturday Matters, and we have what might be a contrarian kind of mystifying but intriguing. We all like a good think, and maybe we'll find out why we should like antisocial thinking. There is one little bit of business where's Mikhail? Oh, he's hiding. Would you please come up here to the front, Mikhail? Please come, can you come up here?
Okay.
You're in trouble now. I think most of you know, tomorrow is Mikhail's birthday, so we're going to start this off by singing happy birthday to him. Okay.
Big 2-7.
Whoa! Just a little kid, isn't he? But we love it. I don't think Barry needs any introduction except for those people who are new and haven't had the pleasure, and you'll find out why all the rest of us pack the auditorium. And I'm going to shut up and sit down and listen. Barry.
I'm a little bit at a loss this morning. I take it you can hear me?
Yes.
Before Saturday Matters, we were called current issues. So this morning, we might be discussing the events in Russia, the very important events, things that are ongoing. With Karen's permission, maybe after I've finished, we can talk about that. I've long been interested in the challenges of public decision-making. I became fascinated at an early age with the puzzling near infinity of variables confronting policymakers. I never expected to become one. I observed long ago, as a legislative intern, lawmakers speculating about the possible outcomes of alternative choices available to them. To improve the odds for a best choice, or at least a good one, they could rely on science as far as it goes. They could rely on historical trends to the extent that they were available. And always, of course, they could rely on logic. Well, that brings us to this morning. Why did I become interested in speculating about the special nature of pre-governmental social arrangements that we call societies? Well, last year I conducted a series of seminars here at U-House informed by a history of the founding of the nation and the production of a constitution. But something was missing. An understanding of that which came before the formation of governments, the raw material, the clay, the nature of the fundamental human social arrangements later to be shaped by governmental institutionalization. So what were the precursors of governments and of nations like? Distrusting pure democracy, the founders of our republic anticipated and sought to curb the runaway passions of the people. They knew people were not angels, that they had a dark side. And it's also why they feared the rise of opportunistic demagogues like the one that we've recently seen. We're familiar with the endless depiction of the human dark side, from Homer to Shakespeare to Dostoevsky to the evolution of the psychological sciences. In fact, it was reflected upon very directly by the founders in writing our Constitution, explicitly by Madison in the Federalist Papers, number 10, and later by Lincoln, who, with reference to the dark side, called upon the better angels of people. They understood it, and we get it, about the flaws, limitations, and the dark side of individuals. What was not understood, and what I'm going to talk about today, is what we now know about the possibly even darker side of societies. Social organizations, societies, are dangerous not because of the flawed nature of humans, multiplied by the size of whatever the group is, but because of the characteristics of social organization itself. So what they could not in those times recognize is that organized social behavior is more than just a grouping of individuals. The founders flirted with it in the constitutional debates and the Federalist Papers when they expressed their fear of factions. Factions, today we call them political parties, are really mini societies. So let's think some more about the nature of societies. Let's begin with an exceptionally insightful Nobel Prize winning novel, Lord of the Flies. In my mind, it's a brilliant work. If you haven't read it, there's still time. Unless you relocate to Florida or Texas, where it's doomed to be banned. Perhaps it will be banned also in the United States if Trump is elected next year. Any book about a gathering of young boys makes his QAnon followers very edgy. Anyway, a group of educated young British boys are shipwrecked and become marooned on a deserted island. The environment there is cruel, threatening, and necessitating not individual response, but a concerted response by the boys. And that fits the definition of a society, as I'll use the term. So stripped of their social guardrails and their government of laws, the story cleverly portrays their slow but inevitable descent into chaos, savagery, and eventually murder. When in the end they're rescued by a horrified officer of the Royal Navy, the message is that only the intervention of government order can spare a society from anarchy and its tendency to self-destruct. Well, what gave rise to social interactions in the first place? Presumably, they were a response to nature's demand for more than the rudimentary instincts for an individual organism's survival. It's where Darwinian natural selection takes us. Let's engage in some speculative gaming. We might imagine that primitive pre-humans, maybe Neanderthals or Denisovans, instinctively threw rocks at ferocious animal threats. You might picture saber-toothed tigers or woolly mammoths. But they also had to throw rocks at each other in order to secure their survival in a competitive environment. Then someone discovered that a willingness to hold off on the rock throwing at each other would increase their opportunities to fend off animal threats, the amount of ammunition that they had. So quite possibly after they agreed to stop wasting rocks on each other, which had previously represented a survival situation favored by nature, there emerged a primitive society of some few pre-humans. So now I want to recommend another book called The Human Swarm by Mark Moffat. It's fairly recent, it's nonfiction. It's a science-based piece about the nature of societies as practiced by social animals, including humans. So we know there are scientists like anthropologists and archaeologists and others who study societal differences at different times of human existence. There are other scientists like entomologists, not entomologists, they're different. Like entomologists who study various species living in diverse spaces. The study of ant societies, for example, is especially interesting because of their very complex organization. So are Jane Goodall's alarming observations about ape colonies. But do these social organizations, societies of different types, or the same species at different evolutionary times, do they have some common characteristics? I think they do. Societies, by definition, must have an identity that is either self-defined by its members or maybe by its members internally or maybe externally by outsiders. Markers of identification are needed. What are markers? For people, they can be racial, skin shades, languages spoken, religious practices, facial and body tattoos. Comanches used facial tattoos on the plains. If you were attacked by the Comanches, you knew who it was. And the street gangs of Chicago also use tattoos a lot. The waving of battle flags, going up San Juan Hill carrying the flag, you know, with that, or Mount Suribachi, yeah. So you get the idea. Religious practices, facial and body tattoos I've mentioned, the waving of battle flags, passports or birth certificates. Even the now familiar passwords come into the internet, the passwords that plague us every day. For animals, the distinct odors of different ant colonies are markers. The unique sounds of whale species, the characteristic coloring and sounds of different bird flocks, which were graced with here at University House by some of the filming that's done now. So these features define societies. They're the keys that open doors to societal membership. They determine who is included and who is not. So importantly, you can't have insiders without outsiders. So one of the characteristics of a society, by definition, invariably, in every case, includes separation into a we and a they. We call these factions. Friction between the factions is proportional to the intensity of competition generated by their needs, their wants, or perhaps their instincts. Well, why are these characteristics important? Because when resources are scarce or greed overwhelms, the destructive result is hostility. warfare that can lead from unpredictable transformation to the extinction of a society. Depending on the markers, which are subject to familiar politically exploitable circumstances, you know what's happening in Texas now, where the governor is coming down on every weak group that he can possibly find. So depending on the circumstances like race, gender, or religion, whatever's convenient to the opportunist, the conflict may be between societies or within one. For example, if the markers are of physical differences, the result is racism. If the markers are language or religious or sexual preferences, the result is an intolerance that easily can rise to violence. The Indian Prime Minister is visiting the White House now. Let me give you a stark example. You have nearly 2 billion Hindus and nearly 2 billion Muslims who are ethnically related, and they seek to destroy one another. So the brutal truth is that in general, societal organization is characterized by hostility to the other. And as in Lord of the Flies, the end results are violence, tribal breakdown, border walls, and ugly domestic intolerance of exploitable differences. So it goes on the natural. Societies, though favored by and a product of evolution's natural selection, will likely be overwhelmed or self-destruct. Then the burning question becomes, is it preventable? Well, I guess there's hope for human societies. Why? Because humans have highly developed brains. They possess what we often describe as intelligence or consciousness. Insects have something resembling brain material that enables various responses to diverse stimuli. The octopus, orcas, whales, parrots and crows, monkeys and dogs all have something beyond hardwired instinct. Some capacity that resembles intelligence and the ability to learn. But humans perhaps have something more. The ability to evaluate and reject that which comes naturally. Let me repeat that. The ability to evaluate and reject that which comes naturally. Most importantly, to reject even that which is instinctive and hardwired. Now, when does that happen? It happens when it's intellectually perceived as destructive. And what's more, humans can create institutions with guardrails capable of doing exactly that, containing and rejecting destructive natural instincts. So it appears that human societies uniquely can organize in ways that defy even what nature has wrought. They can formalize practices that do something different. We're now speaking of rules enforceable by agreement that, when systemized, are the stuff of which governments are made. But always lurking beneath those advancements are the baser instincts that characterize primitive social organization. Unfortunately, we may be experiencing their upheaval in America today. Not all governments are designed to do what is required. In that respect, plant in your thinking that perhaps that same Darwinian force of natural selection that so powerfully operates to favor some organisms over others might also operate to favor some social or societal arrangements over others. Why would it not? Thinking about comparative government, comparing different governments, the complicated underlying assumption is that nature, even as modified technologically, will likelier select for survival those societies that present themselves as more adaptive intelligently than those that are bound instinctively. But favorable odds don't guarantee a favorable outcome. Let's think about the government particulars that can improve or lessen a society's chance of survival and prosperity. Let's start with structural or institutional differences. Thomas Hobbes opted for kings as a more civilized alternative than living in a cruel state of nature. In contrast, the Athenians and a few other societies opted for democracy, popular decision-making, excluding, of course, their captured slaves. Americans have opted for a blend of the two, but the passage of a few centuries has surfaced deficiencies causing a growing disparity between the preferences of most people and the choices made by government, between what people want and what the system delivers. Some of the anti-democratic features are objectively defensible. Others are a product of the self-interest of the founders, most notably protection of the institution of slavery. We're still stuck with those, and they need to be eradicated to improve the odds against societal self-destruction. Now, I'll quickly skate over most of these items, optimistically assuming your general familiarity with them. First, think about it. The Bill of Rights is essentially undemocratic. It protects minorities, not majorities. But it's objectively defensible, or thought to be, because it's consistent with the necessity for debate in a democratic society. You can't eliminate the people who disagree, as Putin may be finding out. By the way, don't think that every new or expanded right is benevolent. For example, the Supreme Court has disastrously bestowed on corporations a First Amendment right. Corporations have a First Amendment right too. And they can unanimously spend unlimited amounts of money in elections. What a great right that is. Second, the executive branch, the selection of a president and an administration, could be considered democratic except for the Electoral College. It's objectively indefensible and hopefully can be eliminated perhaps by, if we're lucky, by contractual coordination of a sufficient number of states. If the Supreme Court, I call them the extreme court, if the extreme court will allow it. Third, Congress could be considered democratic except for the terribly lopsided administration of a Senate that ignores where people actually live. Unfortunately, the possibility of even modest change of that is so remote, it could only occur in the shadow of catastrophic events like a civil war or a revolution. At least that's my thinking, my opinion. Fourth, the federal judiciary, most notably the Supreme Court, a so-called independent judiciary therefore lacking popular accountability, is in fact an autocracy. Again, its nature may be defensible, and Alexander Hamilton makes the greatest defense in his Federalist paper, maybe 72. But the current scope and the ethical dilemmas can theoretically be narrowed by congressional action, because the Constitution gave Congress in the first place the power to set up the courts and the Supreme Court. So presumably they could impose conditions. And again, if they can, and the Supreme Court allows it, you can get a pretty good result. Fifth, most provisions of the Constitution are politically unamendable, a very anti-democratic feature. So popular majorities wishing to amend are often irrelevant, and serious political convulsions can occur. Prominent current examples are over abortion, gun control, reapportionment, racism, budgeting, and judicial scandal. But there are factors to consider beyond institutions, beyond government institutions. Within those structures, within existing governmental structure, there lies a potpourri of human behavior. Some of it individual, some of it collective, some of it random, some of it purposeful, some of it predatory, some of it selfless. With respect to those numerous behavioral options, let's evaluate the unique and peculiar state of American politics today. For better or worse, our electoral system morphed into a choice between two parties. One party, though, not to mince words, has undergone what can only be described as transmigration. The Republican Party, once entrusted with leadership or as a loyal opposition, has been reincarnated as the party of authoritarianism. Some would say the party of neo-fascism. Whatever the extent of what has happened, how did it happen? Is it the stubborn basic nature, like all societies, of our society? Or are our supposedly corrective institutions, like the historically ingenious Constitution of our founders, failing us? Or are the management options available within those structures lacking the necessary leadership or the equally necessary collective cooperation? Well, let me sum up. Individuals by nature are problematical. But we've known that for a very long time, and we've created ethical and legal norms designed to ameliorate untoward consequences as best we can. On the other hand, benevolent appearing societal organization presents problems that stem not from human nature, but if you will, from organizational nature. The inherent nature of societies, the we and the they. Governments, a product of human intellect, arise to shape and contain destructive social forces. Some succeed and some do not. But even those capable of success require structural appropriateness, carefully selected, skilled, and committed leadership, and as Jefferson said, eternal public vigilance. Well, having discussed all that, is the paradigm shift in emphasis from the importance of individuals to the importance of societies of any practical consequence? Well, to me, it suggests there should be a shift in the public conversation and the public agenda away from divisive, diversionary issues to system reform, so that some of those issues can really be dealt with and we don't have a constipated government, which is what we have now. One example, today you can't pass legislative compromises on abortion, on guns, on climate, or immigration. Why? Simple. Because of the Senate filibuster. Now that's an impediment that can be removed by the voters next year. I guess I'll stop there and open it up for comments or discussion, or we can talk about the events in Russia.
Just on your last comment, how could the voters decide against the filibuster? To me, I have no clue about that.
They can do it by electing, I'm not sure I can be trusted on all of this because I was a Democratic majority leader for a long time. But by electing a sufficient number of Democrats to the Senate to do away with the filibuster. Because there's nothing in the Constitution, there's nothing in the laws that requires a filibuster.
So I've thought a bit about the same problem that you've been thinking about, but I thought about it from a totally different way. So rather than trying to think from the beginning and how it came about, I thought about it from, well, where do you want to end up? And it's amazing how impossible it is to figure that out.
We want to end up in a better place.
The only response I would have is that wherever we want to end up, we're in terrible trouble right now. And I mean that not only as the United States, but beyond globally, we're in terrible trouble.
There are several bills in Congress attempting to increase the number of Supreme Court justices. If that was accomplished, would that be a sufficient incentive to move forward towards a more, I don't want to say democratic, but to ameliorate the current stalemate? Sufficient?
No. Probably necessary because of current conditions, yes. But beyond that, we have to think about the terrible things that are going on where billionaires are controlling a large portion of the Supreme Court, maybe a majority right now. And going back to Jimmy Carter, we have much more an oligarchy than a democracy for reasons like that. So we have to do something about the ethics of the Supreme Court as well as possibly increasing the majority. Maybe term limits as well.
Yeah. Does Congress have the authority to impose ethical standards and or term limits on the Supreme Court?
Well, it's hard to answer constitutionally. They do on my reading of the Constitution, but maybe not on the Supreme Court's reading.
So Congress could pass it, the Supreme Court could overrule it?
They're an autocracy. They don't have to answer to anybody. Maybe they ultimately have to answer to the people if there's enough of a public uprising of opinion.
There's a provision in the Constitution for possibly amending through a constitutional convention, which scares the hell out of me, but are we at the point where we should reconsider that?
That's a very good question because it's a very tough question. Yeah, should we consider a constitutional convention? The problem with the constitutional convention is it can become a runaway convention. And it can undo all that we now have, even though what we now have is imperfect. So that's the issue, and it's a very tough one for me, at least.
Russia, does anyone have, oh, okay, Jerry, and then Russia. If someone has something to say about Russia.
Maybe Jerry has something to say about Russia.
No, I just want you to see, have you addressed that, thought about that question? Where do you want to end up?
At the right hand of God.
I'll exercise my right to silence.
Okay, Lois and then Jay.
I've got a comment that I think is appropriate to that. If you don't know where you are and you don't know where you want to go, any road will get you there.
Can you compare our society and the problems that you've just described with some of the other democracies in this world? Do they somehow do a better job in cooperating or whatever we would all like?
Not to be evasive, but the answer is yes and no. There are some so-called democracies, like India's so-called democracy, that is having tremendous problems right now. There are other democracies, perhaps the British, perhaps the Swiss, and some others that are very successful. And one of the things that we have that is either an advantage or a deficit is the separation of powers. And no country since no democracy since the Constitutional Convention that we've had has adopted a separation of powers, a real separation of powers. Something to think about.
Okay.
On the Russian front, on the road to Moscow,
And that's where they are.
the National Guard in Russia would seem to be pivotal. How strong is that? Is that enough to be a political force?
I have no idea. Maybe somebody in the audience does, but I don't have any idea.
Comparing ours to other democracies, I think you do have to take into consideration the history of slavery and the decimation of Native American populations. And it seems to me that there is a barrier to a sense of community, sense of the desire for equality, because we have this disparity. And you know, there was a recent book about how white Americans don't give themselves social benefits, social security, because it'll also go to the blacks. And I think that's a compelling difference between us and, say, Sweden Switzerland.
We have our history. I hope I alluded to the significance that slavery had. I didn't mention the Native Americans. But it seems to me that we've got to deal with the remnants of that are very stark and affecting us. And I need to mention something that I mention kind of annually. We've never had an African American resident here at University House, never. So think about that when you look around and you see all the white faces and maybe occasional others, but
Only the services.
it's built in our society.
Are there any democracies or governments you know of that consider the writings of the past as a reservoir rather than something etched in stone that can't be changed?
Well, I believe in innovation, and I think many people do, but many others are also steeped in the past and very rigid in their thinking. So I can't answer that really.
Could you repeat that question?
It's too complicated for me to repeat, but maybe
Do you want to try?
maybe Amelia can.
Do you want to try repeating your question?
To consider the statements of the Bible, the Constitution, any of these written documents from past societies, can we consider them a reservoir of knowledge or something that's an absolute, unchangeable statement?
Anyone brave enough to try and answer that?
I would say yes. But do we? No.
Lester, you're thinking.
Okay, I'm seeing.
Always very well.
Is Lester, over here. Do you want the microphone, Lester? Al, okay, you're next.
So, where does free enterprise end up in any long-term view of what is sustainable?
Well, in my opinion, and it's a very contestable opinion, free enterprise has taken over too much of our society and our government. The Constitution never mentioned corporations. Never mentioned it. But yet, corporate rights have turned our government into something of an oligarchy, and that's unfortunate. Elon Musk, Zuckerberg, you go around the world, and these people have enormous power. And the power is international and global. And they are forces that, in many respects, are more significant than formal government.
And yet they are democratic at some level.
They're democratic at some level, but think of this. The founders, for the most part, but not completely, I can't defend them completely, but the founders, underlying the portion of government that they devoted to democracy, thought about one person, one vote. Now, obviously, that's not reflected in the Senate, but they thought that, and Madison wanted it to be reflected in the Senate, but he lost that particular battle. One person, one vote. the corporations believe it should be $1 one vote. So that's the difference.
Back to the social democracies, I spent a year in the Netherlands. And in getting up to speed, I read some stuff, and then the first paragraph of a little booklet was, we pride ourselves on being a modern welfare state. And when I was there back in the 60s, 70s, everybody seemed to be quite happy. Took our son to the doctor's office. They wanted to know my income so they could scale the cost to what my income was. It wasn't a bad deal. I've understood that since then, with immigration and so on, they have something of a racial issue themselves. But anyway, I've admired perhaps naively the social democracies.
Well, I don't know the current situation in the Netherlands, but it is high on the list. Denmark, another social democracy, being at the top of places where people are happiest.
Paul, and then Meg.
Since our founding fathers realized that factions were...
Founding parents.
Since our predecessors realized that when they were writing a constitution, that factions were a serious threat, doesn't it surprise us that they did nothing to prevent it?
To prevent factions?
Yes.
Well, if you think about it, factions are groups of people with some purpose or direction, and there's really no way to prevent it now. To prevent them from having a forceful role in government, I don't know if even that could have been stopped.
You've mentioned the rule of one vote, one person. Could you comment on the discussions about removing birthright and citizenry? I mean, if being born in the United States is no longer the basis for becoming a citizen, what does this imply? And that is certainly one of the discussion points.
Could you repeat your question, please?
Could you repeat it?
The question was about birthright citizenship.
Yep.
Which I understand there's discussion about eliminating it. Okay.
Well, to some degree, it's a value judgment because you can decide or not decide to allow citizenship as the basic element. In terms of the threat of the dissolution of societies, I think it's important to keep that as a main consideration for inclusion, for social inclusion.
But the United States is one of the few countries where being born in the country automatically gives you citizenship. It's not.
And it's a great idea.
In other words, in your opinion, we should be sure to keep that.
In my opinion, yeah. But as I say, it's a value judgment.
Anybody else? Al? Okay. Does anyone have any information about what's going on in Russia right this moment?
Can't wait to get back to the TV. Back to factions. Is this on?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Okay, back to the factions. Our social media have really exacerbated the situation. Used to be that a nut in a community was pretty well isolated. Now that nut can find companions all over the world, and suddenly they are a faction.
Yeah. True enough.
No response.
Multiplied. The worst are full of passionate intensity, right? Anybody else?